and keeping a record, which is good, because, well, if we can keep it open for fresh air, that'd be lovely. Mark, maybe you shut that one. And would you like to just, the ladies did express some interest in coming in. Excuse me. So they did express interest in coming in, so we're just commencing if you want to let them know. Just allowing the other people just to come, a little moment, they've expressed their interest, so... Okay, right. Elijah, come and shut the doors, please. Yes, I think we'll shut them. We're still having a meeting. Yep. Elijah, would you shut the doors, please, so that we keep the noise out? We can keep one ajar. We've got good cooling system. We're comfortable. I think we made this our home today. We've been moving furniture, moving this and that. We're here. But my name is Sharon Firebrace, and I'm a radio broadcaster and presenter. Producer on Radio 3KND, which is the Indigenous radio station, based here at Preston, just over the back. And I've also was very privileged in founding the radio station, some 14 years ago. So, and of course, through working with a number of Indigenous people, in particular, Auntie Lisa Blair, who's now passed on. But she and I worked on the ABC radio. I was also presented there with Terry Laidler. Once a week, a little while back. But that's the background, that's the basis. But as Aboriginal people, we've always wanted to have a voice and a place, and that's obviously been a voice for us. But our voice has got to be united with those that have been with us in the trenches for many years. As we talk about our history, we can see that the trenches, the civil rights trenches, people like William Cooper and Auntie Marge Tucker, of course, have been very much there. And we will get into this. I'm just going to do the introduction, but then I'd like to introduce Uncle Reg Blow here, who's going to give us, I think I might ask you now, Uncle, to give us the traditional welcome, really, with the didgeridoo, and its acknowledgement to country, which I think is very important as Aboriginal people, and then we'll get into proceedings, we'll get underway. So this is Uncle Reg Blow, who's also, if I might say, he's the husband to Auntie Welder Blow, and she's a walker, and we are blood connected in family. And but Uncle Reg Blow here has been a great civil and political rights worker, very much involved in the trade union movement. He's known as the Black Red Ragger. In his days, it was, but did some tremendous work, and he's been very much in a building role in the Aboriginal movement here from the 1970s on, and we go back to many days of being intricately involved in some of the public policy developments, etc. So this is Uncle Reg.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Sharon. And certainly, in accordance with Aboriginal tradition protocol, it's always important that we acknowledge the people whose name we stand on. In this case, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I need to identify who I am. I'm Goreng Goreng, just in case you think I'm a Wurundjeri. But I'm Murray, not a Queensland. From Queensland, I'm not a Koori. But with the didgeridoo, we really lay down a spirit of to create a spiritual platform for us to do our business on. And as it's such an important occasion, Sharon asked me to come along and do that little job, and I said, no worries. So without any more ado, I'll just invite you to close your eyes while I just trade it for a little while and lay that spiritual foundation.
And as we come together this day, it's been a significant week called the Reconciliation Week of events that was very much a project that was on about race relations, improving race relations with Aboriginal people and other Australians. So that's been maintained from the 90s up until now. And this today coincides with that particular week. So we give recognition to that week, however we may feel about that in terms of our contribution and some of the political interpretations of reconciliation. There's a lot of views about it, but the strong element here is that as Aboriginal people we want to keep our place, our strong identity and a strong role, and certainly in interpreting our civil and political life. I'll end it on that without getting too involved. We are here with this panel because as Aboriginal people, we've worked together, as I said, with others. We haven't achieved what we have as a single race of people, unfortunately, because of the genocidal base, the genocidal history to our nation. So the people we've worked with are intrinsically important to the sharing the acknowledgement, the understanding of our civil and political role and our relationship together. Hence, with the show Razor Sharp, these men here have been intricately involved with me in the show and in the presentation of the issues. And I have great pleasure in introducing them to you. On my right is Humphrey McQueen, who is a historian, author and a writer. And he has been, he's got a lot of material, umpteen numbers and records of information and material that he's actually written that is very scholarly, academic, well researched, etc. And he's made a tremendous contribution. On my immediate left here is Professor Sabir, and he's a professor at the RMIT University in the business school. And it was a wonderful connection that I made with him, particularly to do with corporations. It was like we found sort of a mentor, but also to me and to others, but a common mind in terms of the issues that are at stake at the moment. And to my more distant left is Brian Kavanagh. And we get to see the faces here today, we've seen the voices, and Brian is from the Land Values Research Group. Sometimes we put them back the other way. Land Values Research Group, which is excellent. Doing great work, a think tank, and Brian, of course, has been very much involved in Prosper Australia as well in the research area. So that's who we are. But today we've got a very important issue that we are addressing. Well, I think it's an issue that's very important before the nation. And that's the issue on the war on welfare, that is corporate welfare. There's been a lot of focus on, of course, those receiving welfare. There's been a tremendous war waged on those that have been recipients of welfare or in need of welfare. And indeed, a lot of us would say that they are entitled to welfare. But where we've not really discussed in the open public arena the issue of corporate welfare, this is an issue that really must be discussed. And this is what I believe the speakers here today will bring information about this, detail, research, knowledge, and so that therefore we can make our own informed decisions. And that's what it's about. It's about making informed decisions. It's about really advancing the country. It's advancing ourselves. It's advancing our communities. If we fully comprehend and understand really what I would believe to be the crossroads, a very serious crossroads for this nation, through corporate involvement, some of us would say too much corporate involvement, through not just the mining tax debate about how much tax should the corporates pay, and of course they should pay a lot more, but also the issue to do with privatisation of this nation. That is where the system of moving that which is in public asset into the hands of private corporations. That has created tremendous change, and I don't think that we're seeing yet the civil, the political, the social, the economic outcomes of all of this. We're certainly seeing some of it, but we need the interpretation, hence the speakers here today. So I'm going to ask Humphrey McQueen to address this first. We're going to have 15 minutes each, and then after that we'll have some time for question and answer at the end. and then we'll have a quick lunch at the end as well. So Humphrey, I'll invite you to speak to us, please, about your views on this issue of the war on welfare, well, corporate welfare.
At least once a week for the last year and a half, I've been saying, a pleasure to be with you, Sharon, but we've been always doing that on a telephone line. So it's a special pleasure to be doing it in the flesh here with all of you today. And to thank Reg for his welcome as well, and remembering, and Sharon introduced him as a red ragger. When the Aboriginal movement got reorganised in New South Wales in the early 1960s, the founders of that activity said, they approached the trade union movement for help, and they said that given that Aboriginal people are a working class people, it's only natural that we should turn to the trade union movement for help at this time. And as we know, the unions gave an enormous amount of help throughout the 1960s and thereafter. In the time I've got, I just want to try and make 3 points. I mean, Sharon introduced me as an historian, so I suppose part of my job is to give a bit of history as to where the corporation came from. Because the corporation wants us to believe that it was made by God, that it was sort of there with Adam and Eve in the garden. It's eternal, it's universal, and it's natural. And if it's all of those things, of course, then we can't do anything about it. It's like the weather. You're just sort of stuck with it. But, of course, the reality is the corporation is a historical creation. There used to be what were called crown corporations. A crown corporation was that the crown, that is the government, would give a group of people the right to build a particular activity such as a bridge or a canal, and they would have this right for 20 years. They could charge a toll on it to get their money back, and when the 20 years were up, then it would become public property. These were called crown corporations, and they lasted into the 19th century. But this, of course, was no use for modern capitalism. Modern capitalism couldn't expand if you only got 20-year permission to run something. So in the middle to the late 19th century, as capital changed and expanded again, they had to find a new organisational form, and that's the modern corporation. Now, until about the 1880s in the United States, the modern corporation was illegal. They had to find a way to make it legal. They had to go back into the common law and find precedents there and turn them around, and in the US Constitution to say, well, this new form, which can go on forever, that can keep on expanding, go from one state in the United States to another state, which was part of the thing that was illegal. All of these things had to be changed. Now, you'll probably be as shocked as I was when I discovered how they did this. There was a civil war in the United States, which was not designed to free the slaves, by the way. That was an afterthought. It was designed to keep the United States together, because the South wanted to secede and run a different system down there. And the North said, no, we've got to hold on to this, because otherwise we won't be able to expand. The northern manufacturers needed the production of cotton in the South, where Lincoln came from in the centre. They needed to be able to go down the Mississippi River system and export through there down into the southern states. So it started out as a trade war. And then, as it developed, Lincoln felt that he needed to win the war to free the slaves and to weaken the strength of the South. But when the war was over, there was no doubt that the slaves were to be freed. And they amended the American Constitution 2 or 3 times to make sure that this happened. And the 14th Amendment is the one in which it was focused. And I won't go into the way in which constitutions are worded, but what it basically said was that a person cannot be deprived of their rights in the United States. Now, you might think, well, that's pretty clear. What's it got to do with a corporation? Well, what the lawyers argued up and down to the Supreme Court for 20 years was that a corporation was actually a person. Now, previously, persons could be corporations. That was the old system. They said, well, now in the modern world, we want to turn that around. And it went back and forth, and people argued against us. It was outrageous that this thing that was meant to free human beings from slavery was now going to be used to enslave wage workers through the corporation. So eventually the Supreme Court said, we're not going to hear any more argument on this question. We're just going to agree that a corporation is a person. And we'll have all of the legal rights under the Constitution that a human person has. Now, they've yet to become President of the United States directly. And somebody said very recently, and very aptly, that they'll believe that a corporation is a person when Texas executes one. So I want to make that point at the outset, to make it clear that the political argument that the corporation is this natural creation, that it's always been there and always will be there, is a piece of propaganda. So we need to know what the history is, so we don't swallow that, and we can take this out and tell other people where the corporations actually came from. So that's the first thing I wanted to get across. The second thing is another bit of recent history in Australia. I should throw in there that if you look at the Australian Constitution, there's a section in there about corporations too. It was written in the 1890s, at a time in which people were very fearful of corporations. And effectively, the bit in the Constitution about corporations gives the Commonwealth, or gave the Commonwealth, the power to control corporations. Over the last 112 years, of course, that power has been turned around to give more power to the corporations, not to take it away from them. But if you go back and look at what people were saying at the time, they were fearful. Even quite conservative people were fearful of these corporations. Most recently, the corporation's power was used to justify work choices, to claim that unions were corporations. A complete twist on what corporations had been when they started and what the idea in the Constitution had become. On to the second point, which relates to the current argument over mining royalties. I'm just saying to Brian that an old friend of mine, who died about 20 years ago now, had been financial editor of the Sydney Morning Herald for 20 years. He had a falling out with them. To give you some idea of the kind of person he was, they offered to make him editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. And he said, well, that'll be nice. They said, but you have to agree to support the war in Vietnam, which was the Fairfax family policy. And he said, no, I won't do that. And they said, well, then we can't have someone who's editor who doesn't agree with our policy. So rather than give up his principles, he left the Herald when he could have been the editor-in-chief of the Herald. So he went and did some other things, but when the Labor government came in the end of '72, Rex Connor, who was the Minister for Minerals and Energy, got in touch with him and said, there's a question I'd like answered and no one can tell me what the answer is. What contribution has the mining boom made to Australian welfare. I'm told that we'll all get it later on out of taxes. Hasn't come yet, but it's somewhere in the future. None of my public servants, none of these people here in Treasury, they can't give me an answer to this. I wonder if I could employ you to try and find out what the answer is. And Tom said, you know, I've been editor of the Financial Herald, at the Herald for 20 years, and I'd never thought to ask that question. No one had thought to ask that question, or let alone try to answer it. So Tom set to work, and in April 74, he delivered a report. And what the report found was that far from the mining companies contributing to Australian welfare, the Australian taxpayer had paid them $127 million to take the dirt away. Now, 127 million doesn't sound much today, but you know, this was over 40 years ago. These were huge sums then. The Industries Assistance Commission was then set to work out whether these figures were accurate or not. They worked on a different scheme. They came up with a figure that no, we hadn't paid them 127 million. We paid them 27 million to take it away. But we still hadn't got anything out of it. And Tom said he was sure that he was right when the Bjelke-Petersen government, the moment within a fortnight of the report coming out, bumped up the rail freights in Queensland on the mining companies. They hadn't realised that how much they were losing as well. They couldn't alter the royalty arrangements because they were contracts, but they could alter the freight charges. And they thought they would get some of their money back, at least some, by making them pay more to move the coal and the bauxite across the land on Queensland Rail. Now that gives us some idea of what the boom was when it first started in the late 50s, with bauxite and Weipa from 1957. Then the Pilbara and some of the coal activities that started then. Much smaller than they are today, of course. But the question I think that leads to is who is asking Rex Connor's question today? Where is there anybody who's had the resources given to them in government to find out how much these mining corporations have contributed to the welfare in the last 20 years, in the last 15 years, since the boom has gone on? The more we look at it, the more we know that they're not contributing anything yet. But it's all going to come at some time in the future. And one of the reasons why it doesn't come, and it didn't come then, is because they have these depreciation arrangements, that their capital investment, they can write it off so they don't pay any tax. So that's the second point I wanted to get across to you, that we've been here before. We found out what the answer was then. We need to start asking the questions and demanding those answers again, that whether it's the Industries Assistance Commission, whether it's Treasury, whether it's a special investigator that actually tries to tell us in real terms what we've got, or indeed, more likely, how much we've actually paid them. Because that's what was happening. We were paying them to take the dirt away. And remember, it is dirt. They're not value adding. Nothing going on in Australia that adds to the value of this. A bit in the bauxite area. But the rest of it is just shipped straight out as dirt. And the other story that Tom tells in there is about Nauru. And as everybody said, as the Nauruans said in the 60s, when the bird ship runs out, what do we live on? And the Nauruans had enough sense to think we're going to take the royalties and build a tower block in Melbourne and live off the rent from that. Now, unfortunately, as the years went on, that fell into hands of people who it shouldn't have had control of it. But they had the right idea, that they had to get something to live on when the bird shit ran out. You know, something that the wisest people running Australia don't seem to have grasped, that the dirt is going to run out. So that's the second point. The third point I wanted to make is to play on the title of the talk. And I'll just finish with this very quickly. The war on corporate welfare. What we see is the way in which governments wage war on Australians and people everywhere in the world on behalf of the corporations. Kevin Bratton is perhaps going to come and speak here today from the Maritime Union. We saw in '98 how Reith used government forces to wage war on the maritime workers. We've seen and see today how the Howard government and now the Gillard government and the Rudd government in between use the Australian Building and Construction Commission to wage war on construction workers on behalf of the corporations. And then if you look at those corporations, the amount of illegal activity that they get caught doing, Lend-Lease, one of the biggest in Australia, they've just been made to pay $55 million in fines and penalties in the United States for price rigging over 10 years, including on the memorial for 9/11. But there's no commission to chase up those corporations. There is no equivalent of the ABCC to look at what those corporations are doing. But they use the balaclavas and the dogs, they use the police, they use the Construction Commission to make war on working people on behalf of the corporations. So the war's going on, but so far it's been largely one-sided. And what we're doing, and what Sharon does in getting this discussed all the time, is to try and turn that around, to try to even up the balance of forces about this. We need to even up the balance in terms of what we understand about the corporation and where it came from. We need to balance up the forces about what the mining industry and the corporations provided in the past, when it was nothing, and ask the big question, what are they providing now? And the third question is to remember that they are waging war on us in every kind of way, every second of every day. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. So we'll hold our questions. I hope that you found that interesting. I'm certain you did on what Humphrey had to say. Keep your questions and we'll have them at the end. But now we'll introduce Brian Kavanagh. And Brian's involved with research at, he's involved with Land Values Research Group, but involved also with Prosper Australia, a great think tank. So good, Brian, thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. I want to talk about the mechanism for corporate welfare because I think that's pretty important. I take Humphrey's point about corporations in themselves, they're definitely a problem. But I think there's an economic mechanism that they're given rights to that we need to be aware of. And if you can leave here today, understand anything about economic rent, I've done my job. Well, what's my background? I'm actually a property valuer. I was with the Australian Tax Office for 18 years as a valuer. I was Assistant Chief Valuer at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia for 8 years until I then, with a colleague, established my own property valuation practice, and we're now about 50 souls working, and because my two co-directors are 20 years younger than me, I'm working my way out of here at the moment, and I'll be even freer to talk the truth. Because it's amazing how the job does sort of, I've written articles for my Valuer magazine and so forth, and I've parted the crowd of valuers at the annual general meeting when I said we should be capturing rent, and I walked back through and we get a cup of tea, and it was like I parted the Red Sea, because they don't want to hear these sorts of things being said. But I can be even more outspoken in future. What are my qualifications to speak to you? I think I've got some. In this British magazine, Geophilus, in 2001, I actually forecast this downturn in an article entitled "The Coming Kondratiev Crash, Rent-Seeking, Income Distribution in the Business Cycle." In it I said, don't set your watch by it, but I think the world's going to be in trouble by 2009. Now, how did I come to this conclusion? Well, unlike most economists, I don't know whether Sharif is like most economists, but most economists don't understand the theory of valuation, and that's the theory on which valuers work. Any property, if you're valuing any property, you can value it on direct comparison, but the usual way is to particularly with commercial and industrial properties, you get the rent that can maintain from year to year, and you capitalise that rent, and that gives you the value of the property. And what I was doing was following a build-up in rents, and I said, I think we've got an incipient property bubble here in 2001. It started in 1999, and I said, this is shaping up to be a biggie, and I think it's going to crash across the world. And that's simply because I followed economic rents. Now, economists often talk about the theory of value, but I'm talking about the theory of valuation. Let's say a block of land out there could yield $16,000 per annum. At the current yields are somewhere around about 4%, so if you capitalise that at 16,000 at 4%, that means you multiply 16,000 by 100, divide by 4, that'll give you a capital value that you're all aware of. That block's selling for 400,000. Everyone knows, yeah, that sells for 400,000. But many economists will say that is valued at 400,000 because of supply and demand, or they'll tell you it's because of its zoning. They won't tell you it's because of its uncollected rent. You with me? So if that rent was 16,000, that's the privately capitalised rent. If the government saw fit to take 8,000 of that 16,000, at 4% they would capitalise up into 200,000. So a lot of us as property holders don't want to see our values go down, but if we're about to have a major crash, even a depression, and our values go down, I hope we keep them down by then employing a property tax. Unfortunately, we often hear, what about the poor widow? Well, provision can be made for the poor widow. Definitely can be made for the poor widow, but where this is the exception is made the rule, and over the last 50 years we've wound back the capture of economic rent. If you go back through history, and this was pretty typical, any time a community comes together, rents rise. That's the annual value of your properties. They rise as new roads are put in, and the government in ancient times used to believe that, well, that was fair game to be captured back to the community. Here's, for example, Philadelphia's first tax law, the City of Brotherly Love, Philadelphia. 30th of January 1693, put to the vote, as many are of the opinion that a public tax upon the land ought to be raised to defray the public charge, say yea. Carried to the affirmative, none dissenting. None dissenting, that's because they understood the principle involved. The bloke who had his shop in the middle of town and his house in the middle of town should pay more than the person on the fringe whose property was not worth much at all. This was the principle. And he should contribute on the basis of his rent, because that rent expressed what an advantage he's getting over the bloke on the fringe of the town, so he should give that back to the community. He's in the middle of the town, he's done nothing to create that, the public's done it. This was a principle that was understood, but what we've done, we've ratcheted back our property. You know, we all complain about our rates. My late father-in-law used to go down to the Oakley Town Hall every year and complain about his rates. And I said, did you ever complain about your income tax? He said, don't be stupid. How can you complain about that? Income tax has always been with us. Well, it hasn't. In Australia, it came in as a World War II measure. States used to income tax. We used to get a lot of our revenues from rents, certainly excises and other things, but unfortunately the powers that be are able to push out these people, the exceptions like what about the poor widow, and So this has been a good thing. We've wound back all these rates and taxes. Even Gough Whitlam was part of that. Councils used to fund themselves, but Gough Whitlam heard councils during this property boom of the early 70s. They were complaining, oh, rates are getting too high for people. So he undertook to pay half council revenue out of federal revenue. And overnight, that was a terrible thing to do, because that allowed more rent to be captured by rent seekers, particularly the big people who've got the most valuable properties. We also wound back through the late 70s and early 80s our death duties. That's another way, at least, of regularising things. The super wealthy who left to their kids, you get some of the rents back by way of this. But it's been a feature of the last 40 odd years, I'd say, that we keep winding back rents. Now, private rent seekers, they've done a good job in making the principle behind the public capture of land and resource rents invisible, and that's why there wasn't a lot of opposition to Gina Reinhardt initially when she said, the government's after my rents, I've done all this. Well, Julia Gillard's come out recently, the last couple of days, saying, no, these are the land's owned by the Crown, and that should be paid back equally to all the people. Just as in Philadelphia, the rents were captured and paid back to make the roads and so forth. And as a valuer, I'd just like to give you an example. Say I own a pub around the corner, and it's making a profit of $200,000 after all costs. I get a bit old and I decide to put a tenant in. The usual practice as a valuer is to say, is this net profit sustainable? Rightio. Well, what will happen is $100,000 will go to the landlord by way of rent, because he owns the freehold, owns the land, the buildings, and he's established the business. The tenant will take the other $100,000, so you go 50-50. Well, I'm here to tell you that's exactly what's happening with Gina Reinhardt. She's got our resources, we're the landlords here, and she's complaining and spent $25 million in advertising along with Clive Palmer to tell us, no, that's not ours. How dare they get this rent? Now, this is just crazy stuff, and this is part of this exploitation that's gone on over the last 40 odd years. And so just before the property market burst again in 2007 in America, I got a report, Unlocking the Riches of Oz, a case study of the social and economic costs of real estate bubbles 1972 to 2006. And it showed all the booms and busts, and it's so repetitive you can write the script. I mean, Gough Whitlam, that's what kicked him out. He wasn't a great economic manager, but there was a bubble that burst in 1973, led into the 74-75 recession. We had an 81 property market peak. That threw Fraser out in 82, 83, 88, 89 as a commercial industrial peak. But in Houston wasn't thrown out in the 1991-92 recession, you might remember, because Keating hung on by the skin of his teeth when Houston couldn't explain how GST was going to affect a birthday cake compared to a normal cake. And so that tricked him up on television. But so now we've got this bubble that's gone on since 1999, and I estimate it's got 805 billion sitting in the bubble part of it. We've spent something like 2.8 trillion since 1989 on real estate. 805, it's a bit technical, 805 trillion of that is in the bubble. Now that's going to come home to roost and settle on the banks, and we're going to be expected, first of all, the biggest rent seekers are our banks. They're happy to see us pay double inflated prices, because if we pay a double inflated price, they'll give us a mortgage based on that and put our next in the mortgage mix for the next 30 years to pay that off. I mean, it is crazy. So banks are ripping off our mortgages. They're turning billions and billions of profits, but what's happened in the United States and Europe? They're going back because they're going bankrupt because they can no longer, their loans are going down. So what happens? They put their hands out to us to be bailed out. Now, if any other normal business, any other normal corporation, they'll get taken over, just as the State Bank was in the 90s downturn by the Commonwealth Bank. But no, it's so bad this time that they're putting their hands out, and of course we're being given the word, oh look, the financial system would be done on its knees if we let these banks go, but also taxpayers harness up and bail us out. I mean, this is just so stupid. So it's a privilege to talk to like-minded people here today, and I only hope that we can get the message out and understand this business about rents, that rent does arise in the community. It's the glue that holds us together. And if we capture that rent, but in this book we established, I could give you 6 economics textbooks that say that the rent in the community is only 1%. This is because economists don't understand the theory of valuation, and we established the rent to be 32% of the economy just on land rents alone. Total land rents at 32% of our GDP. If you add into that our resource rents, our spectrum rents, fishing and forestry rents, you're talking about 40% of the economy. And this is where the wealthy set themselves. They're capturing our rents, Gina Reinhardt-like, and just we're creating these rents, they're grabbing them and say, oh no, it doesn't exist, it's 1% of the economy. I mean, it's the greatest lie, and somewhere along the line, economists are going to start to speak to valuers, because I think it's manufactured, of course. I don't think that neither the two are meant to meet. But the moment you understand real estate valuation, you'll see that rent is not 1% of the economy, not worth picking up. That's what we should be setting our caps for and rectifying this whole situation. Thank you.
Doing that too, you might find that as what happened with Gough Whitlam when he tried to nationalise our resources, he ended up being terminated, and Rudd as well. So it's not without a big price, and as you said, 40% versus 1%. Yeah, there's a big there's a lie there, and it's all a money factor. And again, too, is that not corporate welfare? Indeed, if it all comes to the forefront, they've certainly been able to make a big benefit, a big financial benefit out of that, at the expense of other Australians, and that's what we're hearing here, definitely. I'll ask, of course, because of the time and clock, our next guest speaker to join us, and this is Professor Sharif As-Sabir from RMIT University, from the business faculty, of course, business and economics. So I would like you to speak to us, please, Professor.
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot. I think following Brian's and Humphrey's comments, it's difficult to say anything else. Just to start with, I would like to mention one of the news items this morning. That if you have listened to radio or TV this morning, the news was that there was a $17 rise of minimum wage of Australian, those who are at the lowest level of our so-called economic hierarchy. Now, what does it mean? $17. If you actually multiply that with 50, we are talking about $850, right? And our Prime Minister is very upbeat about it, that we have done something. What have they done? In 1 year's time, if you compare 2012 as against 2011, how much money you are spending now in the groceries, in terms of groceries, in terms of fuel, in terms of your daily utility uses, $850, and we are boasting about it. That is the problem, where we are. And that signifies the problem in the system as well, that when we refer to this kind of assistance or help, especially when we refer to the low-income people, that is where we end up with $850. Now, compared to that, Brian mentioned about one of our richest people in Australia, Gina Reinhardt, and we are not talking about $850. We are not even talking about $850 million. We are talking about billions of dollars. That is where the problem is, my friends. Now, when we talk about the role of government, I would like to mention Humphrey's presentation was enlightening. it does tell you the history of corporations. It also talks about the role of government to a certain extent. And the primary question we should ask here is, why do we need a government for? And that question needs to be answered from many different perspectives. One very normal perspective, if we talk about government, we refer to constitutions, we refer to various rights and responsibilities of government, and what are the rights and responsibilities at the same time of ordinary citizens. All these things do crop up, but the primary question remains unanswered, and the government will not tell you why, what do they stand for, right? They would say that, well, we are equally important to ordinary citizens as well as corporations. And when we regard corporations as persons, or when you personify corporations, it becomes a lot easier for the government to justify their actions. Rather than saying that, okay, whether it is equitable or not, their actions would literally tell you what they are all about. That is unfortunate. Now, last night, Myanmar's opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi gave a statement in World Economic Forum. Interesting statement. She mentioned about a number of issues. One issue was, what does Myanmar need at this stage? Reform. What does that reform mean? Political reform, economic reform, social reform. But at the end of the day, she mentioned that we don't want to understand what those reform agendas are. We don't want to actually dig into those reform agendas, but we would like to see whether ordinary Burmese people, their life, whether that is improving. The overall improvement of their lives at all levels, that is more important to see. Whether we don't want to see reform packages, we don't want to see what is happening in terms of government agendas, but we want to see the improvement. Improvement in terms of livelihood, improvement in terms of education, improvement in terms of health, improvement in terms of government housing, all sorts of things. So that is what I think we are all about. That is what we would like to know, what is happening nowadays in Australia. Now, the title of today's workshop or seminar is a very interesting one, A War on Corporate Welfare. Initially, I was thinking that why did Sharon put that title up? But when I started thinking about it, when I started looking into it, and it increasingly came into my mind that, well, when we refer to welfare, what does this welfare mean? I would like to mimic really Humphrey's comment that government is acting as a proxy for multinational corporations. You know, now sometimes we need to go beyond Australia. We need to think something what is happening beyond Australia. Why do we need to do that? Because Australia physically is an island, but literally it is not an island. It is interconnected with the rest of the world. So we are referring here to the interests of not only Australian mining giants or corporations, we are also referring to the interests of other multinational corporations around the world. Now, does it affect Australia? Is it affecting Australia? Yes, it does. It is affecting Australia. In what ways it is affecting Australia? The money, this interesting tax issue, mining tax issue, you know all about it. Now, what is happening now? The money they are spending, about $3 to $4 billion under the new arrangement, and within the next 3 years, they are expecting, this government is expecting that they will at least cough up around $13 billion from those mining giants. ACTU, in one of its recent reports, clearly mentioned that we are actually paying back the mining sector in the name of infrastructure and research and development, all these things, between $5 and $10 billion a year. So, what are we talking about? We are actually trying to collect $3 billion a year, a bit less or more, and then we are actually giving them back between $5 and $10 billion a year. But interestingly, again, our coalition friends, they are saying that if they come to power, they will scrap two things at least. One is the mining tax, the other is the carbon tax. Now, and we are, of course, this government, as well as our Victorian government and the state and the federal government, they are saying that, well, we have a surplus budget. So, do we need to be happy about the surplus budget? Look, from a deficit of $14 billion last year, almost a bit over $40 billion, and we are saying that we will have a surplus of $1.5 billion. Now, 3.1% in terms of savings, and it never happened in the history of Australia. So you are saving almost $44 billion in a year, not in terms of total volume, neither in terms of percentage actually drop in terms of budget allocation. It never happened in the history of Australia. Now, Mr. McKibben, who was one of the Reserve Bank board members, he clearly mentioned one thing, Warwick McKibben, that they're just going to have to completely redo this. They will have to, because it is unreal. It is unreal because if we assume that this government will not last, if we assume that, I'm not saying that it would, and the next government is coming in, the first blow would be $7 billion on the budget. No carbon tax, no mining tax. And then later on, if this recession, what Brian is actually very cleverly put, I think is a real concern, if that recession kicks in, and if it starts affecting Australia, then what will happen to this budget? So, and they will have to think about it. They will have to rethink about this budget. Now, with respect to the real concern about the entire economy, when we refer to these low-income, middle-income people, then the first thing that actually attracted my attention after the budget was about 100,000 parents would be affected by cutbacks to parenting payments, and that would be a big blow. Now they would save $700 million. Right? Look at the silly side of it. $700 million. Right? From only federal and Victorian segment of budget, the initial loss of jobs would be to the tune of 7,500, right? But that's just the initial situation. It would have multiplying effect later on. Then, although we are referring to these $410 and $820 cash back to school kids, but there was no mention about young people, those who are actually accruing a lot of debt from HECS in higher education institutions. There is no upgrading of the youth allowance. There is no special benefit given to the Auss-study people, those who are on that. So, the one, interestingly, $700 million over 4 years to allow small businesses to carry back past profits to offset current losses by up to $1 million. But that is such a such a small amount we are referring to. 80% of Australian economic growth is fueled by the small and medium-sized economy. We don't see that. Why don't we see that? So, and that is a problem. We refer to Woolworths, we refer to Coles, those who are literally monopolizing the market through this special, token in the fuel pouches. And is it right? Whom actually government is patronizing whom? Small and medium-sized enterprises. We are talking about $700 million, another $700 million, and that is what government is spending, and raising $850 a year is a big chunk of government's welfare economy, part of the welfare economy, right? So-called welfare economy. Now, I don't really, the list actually could go on. Given the time, I would not actually go too far onto that. On the other hand, if we just look at the big end of the town, what is happening there? We did mention about this mining tax issue. Another interesting one is thin capitalization. Thin capitalization is a very interesting one, where our companies are borrowing money from an institution outside Australia, and since it is a debt for those companies, they are getting tax deductions in Australia. Hong Kong doesn't allow that, Singapore doesn't allow that, but we allow that because we love our multinational corporations. And whether those corporations are Australian corporations or foreign corporations, we don't care about it. We still give them those bonuses, right? Now, we can talk about a lot of issues, but one thing I would like to mention here, since we are referring to corporate issues. Small and medium-sized enterprises, they are in big trouble in Australia, especially smaller organizations. We need to save them. We need to help them. Now we blame them because of the cash economy. Why do they resort to cash economy? Did we ever think about it? Sorry, I'm getting 1 minute or 2 minutes over. Just let me give you one example. One of my friends took me to a place. He wanted to buy a shop in one of the shopping center, right? He wanted me to have a look at it because of some of very little accounting knowledge, not like yours. So he took me with him, and I went there, and I was looking at the balance sheet and so on. And every time I was actually looking at a new page of the ledger and balance sheet, I found out that they were doing all those cash businesses. And the money they spend on rent, the money they spend on utilities, and if they don't indulge in this kind of activities, no profit, zero profit, minus. They can't run the business. So, and don't you think that the government knows about it? They do. So why are you actually imposing that GST on small businesses? Why can't we say, you don't need to pay GST? Forget about it. Why do you need those GST? How much GST we are collecting from small businesses? So again, so the big boys are okay. They have all sorts of leverages, as Humphrey mentioned. But if you are a small operator, you are in all sorts of trouble. So, and that needs to be looked at. Bureaucracy, interest rate, tax issues. Our small businesses are literally caught in the middle. Save them. Save the country, because these are the indigenous organizations. Another issue is the regional issues. So what Humphrey mentioned, that township. And if you look at the regional Australia, they're becoming barren. And they're selling $1 plots. Still, even that, we can't actually get people there. Why? So what is the government doing to revitalize regional Australia, rejuvenate the regional Australia? What are they doing? So a lot of questions could be there. We can continue on, which I really don't want to, but at this stage, given the time frame. But in conclusion, I would like to say we need a government. It is needed. We can't say that we don't need a government. Government should look at the basics of government. Why should a government actually be there for? What are their basic functions? And rather than helping a particular group or the big end of the town, they should actually act in a manner where each and every citizen, each and every business is treated equally, fairly, and to the best of Australia, to the best of our overall population. Thank you.
Here we are. I want to thank all of our speakers, our guests for speaking here today and bringing these points forward. Now is our chance and opportunity. I'd like to open the floor for some questions. We could have some discussion for the remaining, we'll allow 15 minutes because everyone else has had time to speak. And I might just reiterate here the question that's being posed, and I place this before you, is, the government's responsibility. What is the role of government? What do we think is the role of government in this when we're talking about this issue of the war on corporate welfare? It is a war. The war's been waged, as we've heard from the speakers here. It seems like it's been a war, not just a war on terrorism, has there been, and not only just a race war, as in wars in Cronulla and wars on Palm Island against Aboriginal people, class wars, as mentioned by our Treasurer, but obviously, and privatisation wars, as mentioned by Professor Hodge at Monash University, everything being privatised, and this is the context within which we're sitting. So, government responsibility, what is their role? And as the Prime Minister said today, it is the people's resources we're talking about. We're in a situation where obviously corporations are taking the bigger grab, are taking the greater chunk of the pie. But ask ourselves here, whose responsibility is it to turn the situation around? What can we do? And just one little breath. Whose country is it? So I pose that question, and we'll have some questions.
Yes, I mean, congratulations. This is a wonderful day, and it's really wonderful to actually meet, because I've heard you all on the Razor Sharp program and contributed so much. But I think that there should be a lot more of this in education and getting it out there to the people. Because if there's so many secrets and so many things hidden from the 99%. So there's so many questions I want to ask you, but there's one question that I'll just ask for now. And it was with you, Brian, which I thought, as I was listening to everything about the history and the economics, but it was like you've got the key to the door in the sense of understanding this business about the economics and what is the political... I mean, who are these economic people? Who are they? It's like there's so many families, like, they're like mukai, which to me in our language means like ghosts, that make all these powerful decisions, but I don't know who they are. How many people in this room know who they are? And yet the crux and heart of it seems to be economics and taxation. How do we expose and find out who these people are? How do we make them accountable and responsible? Because it seems to me they've got a lot of power over Labor and Liberal. I would never, ever, ever again in my life vote Labor or Liberal. There are so many people out there in the nation now that they're liars, they're thieves. That's what they are. And they're stealing our land, they're stealing everything. I mean, so how do we do that? The question is, how do we do that?
Well, in answer to your question, and Sharon's in a way, and what is government for, which touches on Sharon's too, basically it's to look after the people on the planet. It's not to look after these corporations. So how you break through is terribly hard, because as a valuer, I'm pretty sure I know what one of the major problems is. if the age and the sun carry so much real estate, real estate brokers have got the run because we don't. I'm a sort of a heterodox, unorthodox valuer. I can see right through this, and I think a lot of valuers and real estate people can tell the cycles themselves. They can see when a bubble is a bubble. They know it's going to burst. They don't care. They'll, do what they can. So you can't break through the mainstream. So it's up to little groups like ours to educate people to such things as the rent of your land and resources. Up to 40% of the economy is being ripped off by these people. That's our natural source of revenue. Untaxed people. I mean, you've got labour and capital fighting each other. Unions versus business. Half the time that's a false fight because they've got a common interest in clawing back the rent and not being taxed on our incomes. Why should we be taxed on? Is it a sin to earn an income? It's a sin, I'm telling you, to rip off our rents because that's publicly created. For a person to go out and have a job, they're doing a service to the community. We tax them. But the question, if anyone here has the answer to how we can break through this mindset, because there are people like Humphrey who've been trying to do it for years and years and years, you can have all the facts at your disposal. I know Humphrey and Sharif have, but how can you break through this mindset that, Neil Mitchell mindset? Oh, people were bagging Gina Ronhart. What's she done wrong? I mean,
is he a point here?
Oh,
very good. Okay, Margaret, please.
I'm sorry that I came late. The reason why I was delayed was because I went to the Australian Electoral Commission to try to get some DVDs for you all in relation to the referendums that have taken place from the commencement when we all federated under one Commonwealth of Australia. And to date, I haven't heard anyone talk about the rights, the inherited rights that we have in our Constitution as per Section 51. Okay, but firstly, I would like to recognise the original people of this country, the Wurundjeri people. The land was stolen. So keep this in mind, and I will never forget, right? Has any of you went and read the Hansard debates, the conventions that took place before Australia became federated?
No, I haven't.
No. Also too, the GST. The GST doesn't actually hurt the small business, because I do have a small business. It actually hurts the purchaser if the retailer pays the end story of the GST. Also, the GST is invalid, okay, because you can't tax upon a tax. Section 51 says it all, but you should only be taxed for one item, okay? Right? Also, in relation to corporations, so this is why I wanted to go and get the the DVD, no, I get confused, the DVD, and you can get it online, which I'm going to get that DVD. We have so much inherited rights from our forefathers and our ancestors. It is called a common law jurisdiction. And even if the land was stolen from the original people, common law jurisdiction takes place. It's inherited. We are born with it. It's inalienable. No corporation can take it away. All right? And even when those vessels did come here, they worked under a corporation. Okay? Now, in relation to corporation, I wanted to introduce to you the referendum that was in 1913, that we the people voted that we do not want corporations, right? Section 51 of the Constitution is foreign corporations and trading or financial corporations formed with the limits of the Commonwealth, okay? If they inhibit the Commonwealth where it's to our detriment, then corporations do not have authority. Also to Professor, I've got information to give you as well. Now, and also people are actually holding groups throughout Australia, and one that you can be invited to come and listen to. It happens on the last Wednesday of each month at the Community Law Resource Group, and people older than myself who actually know what has happened prior to 73. They have the history that we won't hear in the media. And it's the last Wednesday of each month. The address is 4 Renown Street, Burwood. Now, the other thing that I've heard mentioned is government. In the Constitution, we have 3 levels of government. Parliament, the judicature, that's the court system, and the Governor-General. We, the people, are the government. So when we refer to so-called elected representatives, because there's no political parties in the Constitution. We never voted to have a Liberal, to have a Labor, to have a Greens. In fact, all the representatives are meant to be independent representatives, and each independent representative is supposed to represent their own backyard, their own electoral, and listen to the will of the people. Okay? Now, going back to the Valuer General, I come later, so you're the valuer. I want to ask is, when the land was stolen, then we had a contract with the Crown. The Crown gives us the right of fee simple title. So when did the people give up their rights to fee simple for charges like rates to be attached to capital improved value? Also, the other question is the Reserve Bank. If you look at the Reserve Bank monies, you will find there is trillions of dollars lent, but when you compare the deposit, it's hardly anything. So we all know worldwide that there's fractional lending, and this is why all countries are becoming bankrupt. So we can be bankrupt, so we can go to the World Bank and ask for handouts. Also, we talk about corporations. I'll say this because I could give a lecture. The Commonwealth of Australia is actually a registered company. Did you know that? Did you know the Commonwealth of Australia is a registered company?
With whom?
It's registered in DC, and I've got the number here. Okay? So there's a lot more. We do have inherited rights.
We do indeed. Would you like to just answer a couple of those points there? And,
Well,
try and squeeze another
there
one
are
in.
several instances of where taxation could be deemed to be illegal under the Constitution, unfortunately. Unless you've got the sort of wealth that companies have, multi-millions, you can't mount a High Court case, so a lot of it goes begging. As to freehold title always used to, in English law, you had there was a thing called a quit rent, where the rent was to be paid. Australia, on any property, the quit rent, so rates are a form of quit rent. I agree with you, we were never given the right, we should never pay rates on our improvements, it should only be on the land value. But the quit rent sort of diminished as the government started to dispense favours, just as they have with taxi licences. And thank God we got Alan Fells coming out and saying that's another form of rent. It's a number of licences are restricted. We've got a big population, so the ownership of a licence has been worth $500,000. He's saying they've got to pay $20,000 a year now. That's going to reduce the value of a licence. That's capturing the rent. That's what would happen to property. If we get our taxes from where we should, from privileges granted for the occupation of land or resources, we'd be, and get taxes off people for working, get rid of the GST, and use some of the funds to make the point that, our Constitution says you can't do certain things, but it's being done. We're being robbed blind.
Yes, stolen and lied to by the
There's been
sounds.
charges laid for treason against Howard, against other people. Okay? But at the moment we don't have a proper constitution, a court.
So can I make some quick comments? Just one thing is that when we talk about the small businesses, since you are actually dealing with small business, what I refer to in terms of GST is not everything in terms of the tax regime. You know that. And which type of tax I refer to, you probably understand that as well. But what I'm saying that it is not that, for small businesses, the bureaucracy of GST is more stringent than GST itself. The compliance issues.
Yes.
But there are other tax issues that we know are quite important as well. But in terms of the governance and the government issue, you refer to the 3 functions of government. That is Parliament, judiciary, and executive. And these are the three areas. But together we call it government. And government has some objectives which are clearly mentioned in the Constitution. Why does government actually stand for? But do we live up to that Constitution? But what is a Constitution? Constitution is a document that is, in other words, known as a contract between whom? Between the people, between the governed, and the government. And it came from a very age-old concept of social contract. And that social contract is very important, that we need a government, otherwise there will be anarchy. We won't be able to actually maintain our businesses or day-to-day work peacefully, and that's why we have a government. So the government, in that case, has a rational responsibility to maintain those things, and it is obliged to maintain them. But when government acts in a contradictory manner, then we become very upset, then we raise all these points. That's where we are at. And deeper into the Constitution, we can go there. Maybe we can have a forum on Constitution alone. I think that would be a good one, where Margaret and others could actually clearly, we need that. We need that discussion. And when we refer to Section 51, I'm familiar with that particular section. I know what is happening and what happened before 73, what happened before 1900, what happened in 1794 when the first ship arrived in Sydney Cove. I know what happened in the port of Port Phillip Bay when the first ship arrived in Melbourne, when the first Aboriginal person was killed, and then the ship actually retreated to Tasmania, to Van Diemen's Island. We know that story, but we need a forum again to deal with that issue. We need to do that because we don't know our own story. We don't know what happened in the past. And fantastic thing you raised, Margaret. I really appreciate it. You should do it. Okay?
Just here and then Susanna.
This is a statement that the Queen was actually forced to pay tax not until recently. She's been let alone and allowed to not pay tax until now. Now she's now starting to pay tax. I'm not sure. It was 2000 or maybe 1970s or something like that.
But interesting one is actually Queen's horse actually won a race yesterday.
Yeah.
And how much did she get actually out of that race? We need to know that. And where did that horse come from? Who owns that horse? And how come she's owning that horse? All right. Okay. So that is the latest news from the press. Okay. So the thing is, this is a very interesting point you raised.
Yes, so again too, we're looking at corporate welfare, aren't we? And I mean, they're getting the backhanded welfare through not paying taxes, levies, and getting benefits and creaming off all the assets of the public. So this is becoming, we're now beginning to see the light of day, aren't we not? Suzanne. Oh, sorry.
Hi, Auntie, sorry. Look, to simplify it for a person like me, I'm not a political person. I'm married to an Indigenous person, but it's like Robin Hood doing the opposite thing. Used to take from the rich to give to the poor. What the government is doing is taking from the poor and giving it to the rich. And we've got so much news now. A lot of people are becoming aware of what's happening. There's a lot of groups that are coming together and they're finding out all this stuff. But how do we bring, not everybody's on Facebook, not everybody comes to this meeting, not everybody understands this kind of language that you're speaking here. So how do we simplify all this? Because I truly believe that the people need to know. The person down the street who hasn't got the computer, the person who hasn't got work, they need to know. How do we simplify all this and bring it to the people? Because there is lawmen and there is lawwomen that go to meetings with the government trying to do the right thing about their land. And the government representatives go there and 5 minutes before they start, they give them this legislation about 130 pages. And they're supposed to read it. Some of them can't even read that pages. And then they get consulted. How do we let people become aware. We need to find, because it's all about awareness.
Yes, very good. I'll just have Humphrey answer that, and then I think we might need to break for lunch.
Can I just ask one question?
We need to stop eventually.
Oh, you just
No,
wonder.
But
that's huge.
Oh,
I mean, I would be very quick about that. What we need to do first is to listen to people, to see how they are understanding issues, and learn as to how the things that we think we know, we can find a way to connect with how people now understand it, and not just go to people and say, look, this is what is true, I know this, and I'm going to hit you over the head with it. You listen to people, they already know lots of things, and you've got to find ways of linking in these explanations that we've been hearing about land valuation and things today. People know about this because they try and buy land, they try and get a house, they're paying rent. These are not things that are totally remote from their daily lives. We've got to listen to how they do it and then link into that. The second thing we need to do is to think in terms of those huge actions that took place in opposition to work choices, where you had tens of thousands of people out on the street marching and organising, that when the 1913 referendum to nationalise monopolies was defeated, nonetheless, there were thousands of people marching through the streets of Australia in 1913 demanding that that referendum be passed. Compare that to the way in which the government tried to introduce the resources rent tax. It was all done behind closed doors. There was no attempt to involve thousands of people, no attempt to call people out onto the streets, because I reckon the politicians are more frightened of us than they are of the mining companies.
Yes.
And that runs right through a whole lot of society. And that if we're going to make these movements, we've got to do those double things of listening to people and trying to get ways of linking up, learning from them, and then putting the ideas across so that everyone gets a deeper understanding. But it is of no use whatsoever unless it is part of a large-scale mass organisation. I'll just stop by saying it in this way. The great strength of the Greens in Australia has been the people who went and tied themselves to trees, the people who marched, do all those things. The political side of it, the parliamentary side of the Greens, is built and grown on top of that. If you cut off that taproot of green activism, then the tree that is grown in the parliamentary system will wither and die and just end up like another parliamentary party.
Well, there we are. Well, thank you very much, Humphrey, for that comment too. And I just want to thank very much our panel here today.
yeah, very good.
Humphrey McQueen on my right, and of course Professor Sabir and Brian Kavanagh for being with us. Let's give them a round of applause. And yes, and don't forget to listen in to Razor Sharp each day, 9 to 11, and Monday to Friday, to really hear the issues, because this is a great liberty and freedom that we have, which is freedom of speech, freedom to associate. These are all the rights inherent within the Constitution, within our civil and political rights arena, and we need to exercise it, as people have been saying here. But may I just close in saying that it appears to be that the war on corporate welfare needs to continue to be waged. We've heard about all these other wars. We've got to wage the war. We've got to wage our war to protect and to defend the rights of humanity here. It's as Professor Hodge at Monash University said, who raised the issue on privatisation and the concerns within that, which is moving all of public assets into the hands of private ownership. And he said that we are confronting a war on privatisation. It's a war of taking the wealth of the many and putting it into the hands of the pockets of the few, and doing it, from what I hear today, through stealth, scurrilous acts, devious acts, where they can get away with it, defying every law and constitutional law and right and of humanity and everything that we consider to be proper and correct. And it's an ugly war. It's a war of no law, and it's a law that respects none other than profit and making profit, and it's driven by greed. I'll leave that with us to say that I'm sure we're going to have forums in the future. This is, as has been said, one of the beginnings of. Do stay in touch with us. We have a connection here, and we've got a blog site, which is sharonfirebrace.com, for those of us that want to get some further information. And we will continue to wage war, and that's the issue. Thank you all for coming, and we have lunch outside the door here.